Hey, Katrina, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Darius.
So, I've been following your work for a little while about communication skills, and it's one of my favorite topics as well because in the past I used to suck at communication. And I always thought it was something that you're born with, and it's not necessarily a skill, but later on I learned it's a skill, right?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people have that in their heads, but it can definitely be learned. It can definitely be taught and practiced.
And I was wondering, like, why do you think, in your opinion, as a communication coach, why do you think that these communication skills matter? Because, for instance, if I'm just sitting at home and I'm like, who cares if I'm a good communicator? So,
Yeah.
what can you do with good communication skills?
Oh man, what can't you do? I think there's so many possibilities in so many different realms of life, whether it's professional, being able to interview well, leave a positive impression to build a professional network, whether it's in your dating life, being able
Mm-hmm.
to attract attention and use the right body language with someone that you might be interested in, to family life, dealing with conflict, learning how to confront people in a way that's positive. And there's just so many aspects of life, making friends, going to, a bar or restaurant on a Friday night and you're waiting around for your friend and you're just feeling like you looking down at your phone. Well, if you're at a bar and there's someone else alone, maybe you can chat with them and get to know them. So the possibilities are endless, but those are just a few.
Yeah, I remember when I moved to London a few years ago. For grown-ups, it's quite difficult to make new friends, right? And
Hmm.
when I started learning of getting to know more people who were also expats, a lot of people told me that they found it really difficult
Hmm.
to, get to know people. And so it's communication skills is not only a professional thing, right? So it's good for entrepreneurs or if you want to get a job or whatever. But
Hmm.
like you said, in your private life as well, do you have some examples that you've recently used in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, it's not super recent, but I recently got a job about 8 months ago. I transitioned companies, and one of my first meetings was with the founder of the company, and it was just a coffee meeting. Like, it wasn't a formal interview. It was just more like, hey, a friend of mine introduced me to the co-founder, chat with him, get to know him, and grab a quick cup of coffee. And that immediately turned into like an interview process, which turned into an offer. And I wasn't even
Mm.
really looking, to be honest. I just mentioned it to my friend that I was sort of unhappy at my role. And all of a sudden, next thing I know, I had an email intro in my inbox and I'm meeting with coffee with the founder. And I think that based on the network that I was able to build and keep up with, like the friend who introduced me, to actually going to that meeting and knowing how to make a really strong first impression, know how to make the person that I'm speaking with feel important, like I'm interested in their company, which I was. It was very genuine. But I think there are very effective ways to do that, whether it's through body language or communication, and that helped leave a really strong impression. And that sort of helped me sort of up my career and get into a really great role with a higher salary and great company. So
Yeah. And
I think
how did
that,
you feel
yeah.
after that? That you were like, oh, I've put my skills into practice and it really worked.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, I was thinking about this podcast and about how we can just share some good tips or some useful tips with the listeners and viewers. So you came up with five tips that people can use to become better at communication. So
Mhm.
I've actually took your course as well. So
Awesome.
the first thing that I want to talk about is just identifying and just like killing your social nerves because that's often the first thing that we. This is one of the first things that we experience, right?
Yes, absolutely. So many students of mine, friends of mine, just people I know, I feel like the first thing that trips people up when it comes to communicating effectively is what's happening in their head. And so that's why the course spends a lot of time breaking down a lot of these sort of mental blocks, if you will, that get in the way and really stop you from putting yourself out there, from feeling comfortable, from taking a social risk, right? It's these
Mm.
nerves that get in our way. And so one of the ways that I teach is to identify what those cues are. Like, what are the things in your environment that
Mm-hmm.
make you feel whether it's insecure, scared, whatever that feeling may be, anxious. And so it may be when you are in a totally new environment. So maybe you're at a dinner party at a friend's house and you've never been to this house before. And so that might be your cue that makes you feel like super uncomfortable. Or maybe it's being put on the spot at work. Like you're in a meeting and your boss or someone in the room is like, well, Katrina, what do you think? And that makes you feel like really uncomfortable. And so when you can sort of hone in on what those cues are, what those things are in your environment or in your life that make you feel that way, first identifying it and finding ways to improve it or have sort of like a plan B option where you can script out cues or routines that you can use is a really great way and a simple way to sort of manage those social nerves. So as an example, let's suppose that one of the things that makes you feel uncomfortable is being called upon at work out of the blue. And so you might develop a routine for that specific moment. So I would say something like, okay, every time in a meeting somebody calls me out of the blue, before I dive into the conversation, I'm going to pause and take a really deep breath. And then I'm going to get started saying what I intend to say.
Okay.
And sometimes just implementing that routine will sort of help you calm down. So instead of talking fast and rambling and being nervous and not making sense, you sort of take a deep breath, collect your thoughts, and then proceed.
So the first step is always just identifying it and also being aware of it, right? Just to get to know yourself a little bit better, like what kind of situations make me nervous or a little bit uncomfortable. And as long as you can find out what those situations are, and just to add to that, I would recommend always keeping a journal, and especially if this is something that's important to you, if you think, I have some struggles with communication or I want to get better at it, I would recommend just focusing on it, for a period and just try to think about your average week. What kind of situations made you uncomfortable? One of my friends recently was like, I don't know where it comes from, but he said every time he stands at a counter to, pay for something, he just get really anxious.
Yeah, no, that's super common.
Yeah, it's very common, right?
Yeah, and it's just these little things. And I think if you can, like you said, focus in on the problem areas and the parts that make you the most nervous or most anxious, the other thing you'll realize is there are also moments where you do feel comfortable, no matter how sort of awkward you think you are. So maybe it's your old group of friends from high school. Maybe it's your best friend who's also your coworker. And every time you go to coffee, you just have a really great time with that person. You don't even bother thinking about sort of all these mental blocks that are in your head. And so you can identify the times when you do well and the times when you don't. Prepare for the times that you don't feel well. And then the other thing you can do is when things do go well, ask yourself, what is happening in those situations? When I totally feel comfortable, when I'm totally myself, what is it about those conversations that make me feel that way? So maybe it's because you're really close to that person. Maybe it's the same coffee shop you go to. So when you see that environment, you just feel sort of at ease and you feel comfortable. Maybe it's the topic. Maybe you feel a lot more comfortable talking about work-related things than you do talking about personal things. So by really focusing in on your problem areas and your strong points, you can begin to identify and plan accordingly.
Okay, that's great advice. I think that's one of those things that is with a lot of challenges that we face. The first step is awareness, and just moving forward. One of the things, moving to the next tip, I would say, I've heard and I've experienced this myself as well, and I still do, is how you approach people that you don't know. Maybe it's at a networking event. It could be in a bar, or a coffee shop or whatever. But do you have a tip on how we can overcome that a little bit?
Yeah, so sort of like striking up conversations and chatting with people that you don't know. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So one of the things that I teach, and it's a really simple way to sort of break the ice without having to overthink it. And I think that's one of the problems that people have is they think that the first line has to be amazing. So you have these cheesy pickup lines, guys approach girls with these pickup lines that never work. Like it just, as a woman, guys, like it doesn't work.
Where
and
does that
part of
come
it,
from? I feel like people just watch too many movies.
too many movies, yeah, too many TV shows. I think it really isn't as important. The first thing you say in terms of verbally is
Mm,
not as important as what you do non-verbally, for one, so
okay.
body language. And people just tend to overthink it. They think they have to come up with something really clever to break the ice, to talk to the opposite sex. But it's just not true. So one of the things I teach that's super easy is introduce yourself and then make an observation of the environment. So let's say you're at a crowded bar. You could say something like, "Hey, I'm Katrina. Nice to meet you. The bar is really popping tonight. Like, is it usually this busy?" So by doing just something simple like introducing yourself and putting yourself out
Mm,
there in the beginning and sort of taking that social initiative, and then just making like a very general statement about the environment,
mm.
something that they'll likely agree with if it is busy.
Yeah.
That's just like a really simple way to start the conversation. And they might say something like, "Yeah, I actually come here every Friday night." And then you can use conversational cues to continue that conversation.
And if they say, "I have no idea. I've this first time I've been here."
Oh, then you can say something like, "Oh, that's awesome. Like I come here all the time. Thursday nights they
Uh,
have a really great DJ," or and we can get into conversational cues a bit to sort of keep conversations going.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah.
Yeah, there's always something you can say, right? Because often we come up with something, you say, "Oh, I might say this," and you
Uh-huh.
automatically start thinking about what a person might say. And too often
Hmm.
when we think about it, we think about the negative things that the other
Absolutely.
person would say, right?
Yeah, totally.
And I think that's. But how would you approach in a business setting, right? For
Uh-huh.
instance, at a networking event. Um,
Sure, sure. So at a networking event, again, you can use the same strategy, but the context is different. So, what did you think about speaker X?
mm,
Or, do you come to
that's
networking
nice.
events often? Or I noticed you worked at X company. I have a friend that works there. So it's the same exact strategy, just in a totally different context.
Yeah, exactly. And what do you think the biggest challenge is? Because these things are quite practical, and you can remember or you can learn these things quickly. But
Hmm.
I feel that the biggest challenge is that it's just that those the insecurity or the inner blocks of like
Yeah.
you know why would I even just approach someone, right? That's
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes back to what we talked about in terms of the mental blocks and the mental things that are getting in your way and
mm,
stopping you from, kind of putting yourself out there. And there's a number of strategies that you can do. I'll focus on one just to make it simple. But visualization is a really great way to envision the conversation going the way you want to and in a positive way.
mm,
So before you launch into something like that, like introducing yourself to a stranger, you might take a few moments to sort of visualize in your head the conversation going really well
mm,
and going the way you want it to, and sort of just taking a pause, visualizing. And when you do that, you'll typically realize that your body language is a little more at ease, you're a little
mm.
bit more positive, and that's a really good way to sort of prepare yourself mentally before actually going into it. And the one thing I also want to throw in that I forgot is when you do introduce yourself to someone for the first time, the easiest thing you can do to bring someone's guard down is just smile. It's so simple,
Okay.
and it's so easy, but it works every
Yeah,
time. And
yeah,
smiles are contagious. It's just like when you see someone yawn, it's contagious, right? Like those
yeah.
mirror neurons are processing and firing. And so by simply smiling to the other person, a lot of times they can't help it but smile back, and
Yeah.
that really gets the conversation off in a positive direction.
So we have actually three tips when it comes to this subject about
We do, yeah.
approaching people. But that's good. So we can smile, make an observational comment, but before that also visualize the conversation going well. And I think I'm a big believer in visualization as well. Because often when you think about it, or when you hear other people talk about it, or when you read about it, you might say, "Oh, that's really cheesy." But I always challenge people just to give it a try, because
Mhm.
it really works, and it's for a reason that so many people use visualization, and you even see it in scientific terms as well. Like a lot of scientific articles and books even just talk about that as well. So I think those are really powerful tips for people to apply. So we were earlier talking about starting the conversation, and the next step I think is how to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the strategies I teach is called conversational cues. And what conversational cues are specific topics that people use in a sentence that you can use to expand on the conversation. So as an example, I might be telling a friend of mine that, hey, I'm really excited. Tomorrow morning, I'm going on Darius's podcast and talking about communication. And so my friend might take different pieces of that sentence and turn that into a conversational cue. So let's take podcast as an example. So she might say something like, oh, cool, you're going to be on a podcast. I love podcasts. One of the podcasts I listen to every week is the Tim Ferriss Show, for example. And so that's just one of a potential conversational cue. The other one might be Darius, like, oh, who's Darius? What does he do? I'm not familiar with his work. And then that might turn into its own conversation.
So like a little bit a curious approach, right? That you take a more proactive, curious approach and just probe a little bit more, just question like, oh, what is this or what is that?
Exactly. And so what that helps you do is, it helps you become a better listener, because you have to actually listen and pay attention to what the other person is saying, which is going to make them feel important. Like, hey, Katrina's actually like really engaged in this conversation. She's really listening and she's asking deeper questions. So that's, in one way, it really helps you become a better listener. But then it also helps you in a very natural way continue the conversation without it being off topic. So, if I were to tell my friend tomorrow morning I'm going to be on a podcast with Darius, or let's say we're talking to a stranger, it would be totally random if someone said something like, oh, well, I really like football. What do you think about football? It's like, well, we were just talking about my podcast with Darius because you asked me what I'm going to do tomorrow. And all of a sudden we're on a totally different topic.
Yeah, that's what guys do, right? That's what guys do. They were like, exactly. Your girlfriend comes at home and they're like, oh, I had a really tough day. You'll be like, oh, tonight's a game. Don't do that.
Don't do that. Yeah. So that's one really great way to keep the conversation moving along. And it can also be a way for you to drive the conversation in the direction that you want it to go in.
All right. So just because often we make things very complicated, we start getting in our head. But instead of getting in your head or thinking about, that's what I always try to do for myself is, and especially now I'm doing more podcasts and interviewing people, is in the beginning I would often think about, the questions that I wanted to ask. But instead I've switched it just to listen and then see what's interesting and just continue on that topic. And I think if you, in terms of like keeping the conversation going, like what you were talking about, just that listening aspect and being curious, I think makes a huge impact. So you don't have to worry ever again about how do I keep this conversation going, because as long as you listen, and obviously it depends a little bit on the other person as well. If the other person just says yes and no, the conversation is quickly over. But if it's a normal social person, or like if it's a good conversation, as long as you keep listening, you can keep the conversation going, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a way to, show you're interested. Like you mentioned, it's also a really good way to get out of your own head. So, the subtext to a lot of these strategies are ways to think about something else other than yourself, right? So when you're thinking about what you're going to say to the person, you're observing the environment, right? So you're not in your own head thinking about like, oh my God, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? You're actually having to look around you and be creative and come up with something to say to someone. In this strategy for conversational cues, you're listening and giving your attention to the other person rather than having to be in your own head, like you said, thinking about what to say next, what do I do, what do I look like? I shouldn't have worn these shoes, whatever may be going through your head, right? Yeah. And the idea and the subtext behind all these strategies is just get over yourself. Like, stop
Mm.
thinking about like what is going on in your head. Like, people don't notice your shoes. People, aren't expecting you to come up with this crazy, great first line to approach them. Like, smiling and introducing yourself is enough. And so that's really what the point of these strategies are, is to get out of your own head, focus on the environment, focus on the other person, focus on other things, and that helps you reduce that anxiety internally.
Yeah, I love that. That's such practical and down to earth and advice, and that also really works. And so right now we started a conversation. You know, we've gotten over ourselves. We got the conversation going. I often think about what should I do. You know, with my body language. You know,
Mhm.
where do my hands go? Like, what should I do?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So body language is a really, really important and underrated aspect of communication. When most people think about communication, they just think about verbal, the language they're using and what they're saying. But what people don't realize is what's happening with your body language is saying a lot more. And it's part of our evolutionary history. So before language, written language, verbal language even existed, back in the day, the only way to communicate was through your body. And so there are still some very kind of hardwired primal instincts around body language, being receptive to body language, using body language, that is very sort of deep rooted.
Mm.
And so when it comes to body language, I think we talked about smiling and the power of smiling, but I want to go a little bit deeper into it because it's one of those things where, again, you don't need to think a lot, you don't need to plan a lot. All you need to do is smile. And one of the things I teach my students, for people that don't get in the habit of smiling, it feels unnatural, unfortunately.
Okay.
For a lot of people, smiling doesn't come naturally. They don't do it, sort of in a very natural way. And what
Why
I
do you
like
think
to
that
teach,
is? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
sure. I mean, I think part of it is probably having to do with like what's going on in your head.
mm,
So, oh, this person's going to think I'm a dork, or they're not going to
mm,
smile back, or all these sort of like mental blocks going on in your head. And we also aren't really taught to smile. It's
mm,
such a
yeah.
powerful thing that I've used later on in my life, but nobody really taught me or told me to do it when I was going to school or going to
Oh,
college. And I think it would have made my life in a social way like a lot better and a lot easier.
yeah.
Um, and unfortunately, it's something I just learned, in very recent years. But it's really, really powerful. And one of the things I teach my students is to practice on strangers. So on your commute to work, when you're walking around on the weekends, just practice making eye contact and smiling with strangers.
Mm.
And like, who cares if they smile back or not? They're strangers. They don't even know you, right? Like, you may never even see them again for the rest of
Yeah.
your life. And just
They
take
might think you're
five,
crazy or you want to kill them, right?
exactly, which will make it even more fun.
Yeah.
But take 5 minutes out of your day, or on every single time you do a commute to work,
Mm.
just pick a few people, and make eye contact and give them a quick smile and just practice sort of getting over that hump. And you'll realize you end up doing it more naturally, and people are just way more receptive to you.
Mm.
And so, again, it's super underrated. And I think it's one of the most important body language cues that really disarms people. It makes them feel at ease. And they associate smiling with laughter, with fun, with ease. And so you're almost projecting your body language onto them when
Mm.
you smile, right? And I think it's a really, really effective way. Last Friday, I went for drinks with two friends of mine. So the two of them I know and I had met before. And there was one person who was new. She came late, never met her before. Neither had one of my other friends.
Mm.
And she was a little intimidating. Like, she kind of like, like walked in, like she owned the place. She didn't really like smile. Um, and but I did. And I would ask her questions. I would give her eye contact. I would smile at her. And I'm telling you guys, people have no choice but to smile back. They
Mm.
really have no choice but to do it. And
That's a big one.
so, and my friend, even after the conversation, said like, oh, like, she was nice once we got to know her, but she was a little intimidating. And I didn't really think that. Like,
Mm.
after, a few seconds, I feel like she was disarmed. She was comfortable. And I think that's all it was. I think it was just being comfortable. And she was also maybe a little intimidated herself because she's meeting new people,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
And
it's
so
funny.
smiling in that example really helped me.
Because I think in a business setting, a lot of people I've experienced this as well that they think that you have to look really with a straight face and really serious because you're talking business or whatever. And
Hmm.
I don't know. I think that's a misconception because that's
Absolutely.
not necessarily you don't have to be like frowning to do business or make a deal.
No, you don't. And honestly, like the best deals that I've put together have been with people where we share a rapport and we share a shared goal.
Yeah.
And nobody in most cultures, even last 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting with Japanese businessmen that came into our office, and I wasn't sure like how sort of they were going to be in terms of like getting to know them and
Mm.
small talk in the beginning. And they were pretty casual, and we had a conversation about Blue Bottle Coffee, this like local coffee roastery. We were talking about their visits to San Francisco. And in most cultures, it is pretty normal to have a little bit of small talk before you go down to business, right?
Yeah.
Like nobody just walks in the room and asks you to sign a contract. There's some sort of like talking or small talk that needs to happen before you even go
Yeah.
go into it. And I've been really shocked working with, Fortune 500 companies and their executives. There's always sort of that bit of small talk, that bit of getting to know someone.
Yeah.
And it's a really great time to sort of disarm them and use positive body language.
Yeah, I'm personally all about that as well. Just connecting with people and just talking about all kinds of things, I think is really important. The only place that I don't do it is an email because I don't think an email serves a purpose. So I always,
Right.
cut to the chase. But
Hmm.
but that's also even in some cultures that's not really appreciated. But especially
Hmm.
when it comes to face contact, uh, it's so important. And just like what you said about smiling and making eye contact, because often people, the standard stuff, right? Just don't sit with your hands like crossed and all that
Cross,
kind of
yeah.
stuff. You
Yeah.
know, that those things are also maybe true, but I think like what you said, I always like to focus on a few things that make a real big impact. I
Hmm.
think that when we talk about the smiling and making eye contact, those things are the make a real big impact, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It totally does. And it's easy to do and it's fun and it makes you feel good too.
Mm.
Even studies have shown that when you smile, you actually boost your serotonin levels, you feel more positive.
Yeah.
And so even when in the mornings when I wake up or meditate, I'll just smile to myself alone. And
Yeah.
I feel like that just makes me feel more positive throughout the rest of the day.
Yeah, I wrote an article about it recently as well. Just smiling just makes you feel good. I'm really
Yeah.
on the same boat. So I think people should do it a lot more often. One place that people don't smile is, or one situation is with tough conversations. So I really
Hmm.
wanted to talk to you about this as well because I think all of us in our career or even in our personal life, at some point we have to have tough conversations.
Hmm.
And what are some ways to make that a little bit easier for us?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the most important things that people discount is sort of the value of confrontation, and not in a negative way. Like, confrontation doesn't always need to lead to some sort of argument.
Mm.
Confrontation can just be a dialogue, right? It can be a conversation around a topic that you might be feeling uncomfortable about or unsure about. And so I think one of the ways to really sort of bring up a topic that you might feel sensitive about to someone else who may not even know that they're making a mistake or making you feel a certain way, is to sort of depersonalize the situation and the experience. So to give you an example, let's suppose that I have a conflict with my husband where every time we finish dinner, I want him to wash the dishes. And this is like a somewhat real life example.
Mm.
So I cook dinner.
Very
And
relatable.
yeah, yeah. So I cook dinner, and then there are times where most times he's good about it, but sometimes like he forgets or he's too tired or he'll leave it for the next morning. And so instead of saying something like, "Hey, Sam, every time I make dinner, you don't appreciate it, and I feel really, really bad about it. Versus, hey, Sam, when you don't do the dishes, you make me feel like X, Y, and Z. See, like the nuance, like the language is very nuanced, but instead of just accusing someone of making you feel a certain way, you're sort of depersonalizing it. So you're not saying that you're the one that makes me feel like crap. What you're saying is when you take a certain action, it makes me feel a certain way.
Yeah.
So sort of, debunking all of those pieces, the first thing you did was you talked about a specific action rather than blaming the person. Like, you're so selfish, you just eat and run and you make me feel like crap. Like, that's a very different approach than when you do X, you make me feel like Y, right?
Yeah. So blaming is never good, right?
Blaming is never good. And I feel like in confrontation, we get so emotional about things that the first thing we do is sort of say it in the easiest way possible. But I think when you're confronting people, it's even more important to kind of be prepared when you're going to confront someone about something that can be sensitive, to frame things in a way that isn't accusing them and is blaming them and assuming that they're in the wrong. And so when you say, when you do X, you make me feel like Y, it's sort of a different conversation, right? Like, instead of saying like, oh, like, why do I make you feel like crap, or I didn't know that, it's more like, oh, you know what, that's a really good point, but the reason I didn't do the dishes last night is because I was working until midnight, or it was because my favorite show was on. Like, whatever the reasons may be, it opens up a dialogue that allows for identifying why that action is affecting you and them.
And I think that's real great advice. A real good tip is the objective with tough conversations is often to have a good dialogue instead of a fight or accusing people. So if you start out not blaming the other and just sharing how something makes you feel, I think is one of the smartest things you can do with tough conversations. I would use this in professional aspects as well. If you're at work and you feel that you're not appreciated or being bullied or whatever, you can just share with your boss how that makes you feel. And because with feelings, you can't disagree with, right? You can't say, well, I disagree with that. That's impossible.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. So I was just going to go into that. So the second part to that is that you're just telling someone how you feel. You're not accusing them and saying that, makes you feel like crap. You're really explaining that you're using the word feel. It makes me feel X, Y, and Z, because as you said, it's really hard to say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. And someone may say that to you, like people, do say that, but the point is to open up a dialogue where they can explain why that may not be justified.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes people say, well, you shouldn't feel that way, but I don't know, sometimes I think I've said it as well in the past, but it's just, I don't think that's something you should do, I think, because it's weird, right? You can't say, because actually what you're trying to say is that I didn't mean it that way.
Exactly.
Right? So you have I think you have to always look at yourself first instead of say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. But just as a bonus tip, I think these are really great. One thing that I also wanted to share is that, or ask you, is how can we can learn about communication. We can learn all these things. It's a skill we can develop. We can get better at it. How can we teach other people in our surroundings, you think, in our relationships or at work or the people in our team or whatever, how can we train them or make them a little bit aware of how important communication skills is, because we have to work together, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for one of the things that's helped me a lot is sort of leading by example. And so people have said to me, oh, like your emails are like super clear, or you really did well during that meeting, like you really prepared. And so during those moments, really seizing the moment and saying something like, the reason why my emails are clear is because I like to use bullet points. Have you tried that? Or something like, the meeting went really well, but that's because I spent, 2 hours working on the deck before we even stepped into the room. Like, have you tried that? Or you might want to use my template. And so seizing the moment, and then putting it back on them and saying like, oh, like, what do you do to prepare? Or how do you think about this? Or sort of adding value, like, let me share my presentation template with you, or let me share how I did that. When they walked in the room, like I smiled, or, I stood up instead of staying seated. So you might share some of the strategies that you have when people compliment you and they notice that. And it will happen. People definitely will notice if you're sort of controlling the room or you're improving socially. People will take notice, and really using those moments of recognition to suggest it to them or to help them be better.
Oh wow, I think that's really that inspires me to because we talked about a lot of stuff, and it inspires me to go out there now and start applying things. And I hope that people who are listening and watching also feel the same. Of let's start applying these things into practice. So I think that's a great way to close this off. One last thing is if people want to get to know a little bit more about your work and your training, what's the best place to connect or website to go to?
Yeah, so my website is called communicationfornerds.com, and that's the best place to find all my articles. You can also contact me through the website, and I love hearing from readers and listeners, so would really love to connect with you.
All right, great. Katrina, thank you for the insights, and
thank you.
Take care.
Yeah, thanks, Darius. Have a good one.
All right, bye.